Hello, my name is Frank Seidel, and I listen to Chris Smit at the Culture Matters podcast, and I talk about how to do business in India.
Hi, Frank. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. I have no idea where you are. I have a vague idea. So tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, because the audience, they don't know you yet, but that will change. Where are you? Who you are, where are you, and what is your so-called cultural frame of reference? And the cultural frame of reference is not spending 2 weeks in Cancun, for instance. That usually doesn't add a lot to your cultural frame of reference. So go ahead.
Very nice. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Sure.
My name is Frank Seidel. I'm originally from Germany, the central part around Frankfurt, and I had a mother from Austria, and so I spent a lot of time in Austria. And I realized that my father could hardly ever understand my his mother-in-law, and so I started to become the universal translator between Austrian and my father, and that continued to be kind of a theme in my upbringing. And then I ended up working and living in 4 countries, including now the US for over 25 years. And I've discovered at some point that I had an affinity for technology. And of course, technology is global. And a lot of business owners or large companies have a problem of translating business into technology. And
Mhm.
this is where I earn my chops. I was always able to be the universal translator between the business requirements and what the technology looks like at the end,
Mhm.
because that's not always very easy to do, right? And of course, doing so, having worked with a lot of teams from India, a lot of companies wanting to do business in India, and this is how this all comes together. My frame of reference is always about how to get things done from a business perspective. And in India, that takes on a, a very complex approach. Um, but we'll talk about that, how we can deal with that and how companies can deal with that
Mhm.
as they venture into India.
So you still speak German, I reckon.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. And French.
And forever, okay, well, that's the only language I don't speak, actually. No, not the only, but it's the
Yeah.
language I don't speak, even though I live in Paris. So what I read in the introduction, the written introduction, was that you have living and working experience in Germany, evidently, in France, in Great Britain, and now in the
Yes.
USA. In general, how would you describe the, well, again, because this is the Culture Matters podcast, how would you describe the cultural differences between these 4 countries in general?
Right. So a story that I always tell people who ask me, so what was it like to live and work in Paris? And like, so Paris also, that's where I was. I'm
Mhm.
like, don't ever be on time. It is rude to be on time because you make the other person look bad because traffic is always bad. You never can get anywhere on time. So if you arrive within an hour, you're on track. And that's pretty much what I took away from Paris. Germany, of course, it's all business. It's, you got to be on time and so forth. At least that's when I was still there. I think things have changed a little bit.
Mhm.
And London was, it was the same thing again. It because of the way people cook. It's the pubs close at 11, everybody goes home, and then the next morning you see them there with crisps and a cup of coffee, and and you really see the same people every day. And also people are pretty indirect, which is something that we're going to talk about, the Indian culture as well.
Mhm.
And so, but to bridging the gap here is basically the keyword. You have to take time to really understand the culture that you're living in, the context, and so forth. Be patient, be understanding, be tolerant. Know that you don't know. It's
Mhm.
very important to remember those things, and then it can become very very enjoyable, and the growth can start to happen too. Before that, you're just trying to do the same thing the way you've always done it, and that most of the time doesn't work in a new culture.
Right. A blueprint in one country doesn't it's not the blueprint for another country. Yeah.
No, just because you speak the same language doesn't mean that everything works the same way.
Oh no, absolutely. So you talk in the intro before I started recording this. You talked about doing business in India or with Indians. How come you ended up there? Because that's not in your list of 4 countries.
That's right. As part of one of my previous lives, I spent a good amount of time in one stretch. It was several months where I was in India, and an incredible experience. Besides, of course, when you're there, all of your senses are just overloaded. The smells, the colors, the sounds, everything. It's just really impressive. And you see rich and poor right next to each other. And the contrast is so stark. And then you're trying to work in your normal context, and things don't get done. You can't get anything done. Everything takes multiple times longer, and people interact differently with you and so forth. But during my time over there, I was fortunate to be invited to people's homes. Normal people they were not, the executives of the companies or something. No, the normal employees, they invited me. Frank, come over, have dinner with us, get to know my family and so forth. It was really enjoyable working with you. And that really opened up my understanding and my horizon about the Indian culture, that there's a lot more to it than how we deal with things. Like you and I, we can do business over Zoom, right?
Yeah.
Well, that wouldn't work in India. It just wouldn't.
Not as easy. No.
You have to be there, right? And you have to take the time to get to know them. And the sooner you do that and you immerse yourself and accept that, the faster things will click into place for you in whatever capacity you are over there.
And what parts of India were you active? Because there is at least a cultural difference between the north and the south, maybe a little less between east and west.
Right.
Although Indians might deny that. But
no. The north doesn't understand the south and vice versa. The dialects are too strong. The religions are different and so forth. And I was fortunate to travel around all the countries. So I was in Delhi, it was in Bangalore, it was in Mumbai, it was in Calcutta, and it was really interesting to see all of those different places, how different they are. And also traveling, it has changed a lot since then. But traveling India, that was an experience in itself, right?
Yes.
And so, the first time I remember in Delhi when I arrived after flying from Paris, and it's an 8-hour flight. It's not too bad. And I arrived and I had my luggage and I stepped out of the airport, and there was just a sea of people, and it all yelling at me, or they all wanted something for me. Like they wanted to help me carry my luggage, or if I needed a cab driver or something like that. Unfortunately, I had a driver waiting for me. He whisked me away into the car. I sat in the back on sort of like a terry cloth seat, and there was a newspaper and a bottle of water. It was at night, of course. You always arrive at night or fly at night. And the first thing he did, even before he turned the ignition, was he honked the horn. So it's very important.
Yeah.
And then on my drive into Delhi, I was reading the paper just to distract myself and stay awake, because it was dark. I couldn't see anything. And then suddenly I was biting into my newspaper because he was braking really hard for a cow that was crossing the street. And it was like, yeah, I'm in India. They brake for cows.
Yes.
It was such an experience, such a new experience.
Yeah.
And so it just continued, the honking and so forth, especially in Calcutta. There were no rules. Everybody just drove wherever they wanted. So
Yeah. It's the I think it's one of the opening sentences that the Lonely Planet uses when they talk about India. One of the sentences I read once is India is an assault on the senses, and it's on every sense that you have. Yeah.
absolutely, yes.
In
Yeah.
your experiences, so you spent quite some time in India. What is the? It's hard to call it good and bad experience. What is the most memorable experience, and maybe a memory that you'd like to get rid of from a cultural standpoint or a negotiation standpoint?
I remember this one time I came back from Agra from a day trip, and I stepped into the cab because I needed to get back to the hotel.
Mhm.
And at first there was the driver, and then suddenly there was a SIG entering, which was really big. I mean, I'm 6'2", I'm 220 pounds, I can hold myself. But
Mhm.
that guy, that was he was a step above that. And then I had a third guy sitting next to me suddenly, after I told him that I was going to go to the Oberoi Hotel, which is one of the best hotels in Delhi.
Mhm.
I'm like, okay, all right. So I kept my mouth shut. It drove me all the way there. And he drove in such a way that my door was actually towards the entrance of the hotel. So the second I could open the door and jump out the car, I did, because I did not understand what was going on and I needed to get out of there. Then just uh, my neck hair stood up. And I told the doorman, who was also a SIG, what had happened. And he's like, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. They got paid. I made
Mhm.
sure about that. But I think there was a little bit more going on because I think there was um, a very aggressive negotiation probably was about to ensue. And that was not something that I wanted to get to be in the middle. I was not prepared for that.
Can imagine.
But
What's the
other than that, it was
yeah.
no, other than that, I think India is an experience that you have to expect that you're going to be shocked. Um, but that's part of getting to know the culture and understanding. And it's not all that bad. So if you stick within, if you go to a large city, stay in the area around the hotel, don't try to venture off into areas. But overall, it's a pretty safe country if you think about it. It really is. Women, especially, they've told me that in the south more so than in the north, but it's a fairly safe country.
Yeah, of course. You have your strange regions, your strange places in every country. I mean, Germany is no different from the
Yeah,
US, is no different from India,
right.
right? So, talking about then the culture of India, and I've always learned that you cannot talk about one culture. You always have to talk about a culture and compare it to another culture. I mean, saying that the Indians are hierarchical, that means nothing if you place it next to, say, China or Russia, for instance, or Malaysia,
Right.
to give an example. So you have to compare countries with each other. Um, First, a close question: Are you because you're helping organizations or individuals that want to do business with India only from the US or also from, say, Germany, France, and the UK?
Wamsa Batra is actually a German company. So my big partners are in Germany, and they've been doing this for 20 years. Um, they've helped over 750 international companies, primarily from Europe, to
Mhm.
get established in India or help with problems in India.
Mhm.
Um, one of the things that companies find themselves in when they start doing business over there is that they start by themselves. They have maybe a local partner who has some experience in doing one part of the overall setting up the business or something.
Mhm.
And then they find a business partner, a local partner who helps them with suppliers and sales. And then they might end up in a situation where the relationship starts deteriorating after about 3 to 5 years, which is in our experience usually the time frame in which those kinds of arrangements start to dissipate.
Mhm.
And the international company might find out that they have actually lost money throughout the entire time, even though they thought they made money. And then they need to jump into action and get into crisis mode.
Is
And
that
we've
due
had
to
many
corruption?
examples.
Do they lose money because of corruption?
um, corruption, let's not call it corruption, but it's probably because of the fact that your business partner wasn't quite straightforward with you, and maybe had a second set of books. And especially, let's take the example of a German company. Like, well, I met this business partner. Of course, we have shaken hands. Of course, we can trust each other. That might be a little bit naive, because you still need to do all the due diligence that you would do, if you were to do business with somebody in Germany. And so, just to give you an example, there was a global manufacturer of alternative energy. They had a business partner in India, and that partner turned out to be very eager to misappropriate intellectual property of that manufacturer. And then they dragged them into the court system and said that they were competition, that there were issues with intellectual property that they had stolen from the international company. The business was over for that company in India, and so they came to us to help them to get out of the court system and have a restart in India. And it took about 2.5 years to get out of the court system, settle all the claims with all the suppliers and so forth, and then restart a new campaign and re-enter the Indian market. And that's what can happen if you start giving your partner too much power and too much authority in setting up the business, setting up the books, and so forth. It should be the other way around, where you have enough oversight that you see all the numbers at all times. It should be okay to do forensic accounting every quarter. It should be okay to have continuous conversation and discussing how the market is approached and set sales goals and expand them and so forth. And basically do it like we're used to in the Western world. And it's not as easy to establish as it sounds. It's very expensive and difficult to change how an entity is set up. So all of those things, they have to be planned carefully and set in place carefully at the onset. And that requires consideration, where your location is, in which state, what kind of industry are you in, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a very complex entity to put these things up, and to try this without any experience, or with an inexperienced partner without a track record, is probably a little imprudent.
Yeah. Got two questions coming up here. This is doing business between, say, Europeans or Westerns, if that makes any sense, in India with Indians, evidently. Do the Indians internally, when they do business, have the same issues with each other? Or are they better able to read the code, their personal code, if you want?
Oh, obviously. Yeah, no, of course. They understand what they're getting themselves into. If you look in from the outside, it's there's a lack of transparency, where if you've never dealt with it, how are you supposed to, the person you're talking to is actually not really the person pulling the strings, or having the authority or something like that, even though that person might sound like they do, but they really don't. And so you have to do a lot of background checking and due diligence and so forth, and in order to make sure that you're really talking to the person who has the authority to make the decisions. But negotiations.
Yeah, go ahead.
Negotiations just take a while to go over. An example is German airline was, of course, in India, and the managing director there needed to expand their business, and so they needed more landing spots on at the airports. And of course, there's a minister who administers those landing spots and gives them out, or a certain department. And so you can't just go and fill out a form and request that. It takes time. You have to build up the relationship. And so from starting to build up the relationship to actually getting those spots took up to 2 years.
Mm.
Give you an idea of how long something that sounds pretty straightforward, because it's a business transaction, how long things like that can take in India.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. In on your LinkedIn profile, you talk about understanding. What did you write exactly? You talk about the Indian context.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more
Yes.
about that? What is the Indian context?
Right, right. This goes into the area of how Western people from the West, or Europe or the US, can easily misunderstand India. They tend to underestimate the cultural diversity. There are up to 1,000 languages that are spoken. There are only several dozen that are relevant, really, or spoken by enough people that you need to know it. But it's very regional. Then you have different religions. They must be observed. They must be recognized and sorry.
Dealt with,
So
or
they also, I'm sorry.
no, deal with religious, or respect them and take them into account.
They must be respected. Yes. It's very important to understand. So all of that comes together. Then, so India is one of the largest democracies in the world, but it has 1.4 billion people. That doesn't mean that 1.4 billion people is the total market, right? For a consumer brand, for example, or even for a company that sells B2B, you then need to go into the regional aspect and figure out, okay, is there a large enough market for me? And so you need to do real research in order to figure that out. However, data is very difficult to come by, especially reliable data in India. So then you need to understand where to source the data, how to verify it, how to cross-reference this, and so forth. And it just makes it very complex. But even just understanding the pitfalls that you can find yourselves in if you do any normal transaction, or any normal thing that you would do in business in the US, for example, you know the pitfalls, but how do you work with them or through them, right? This is why it is very important to find a partner with a track record who understands all of those pitfalls and how to deal with them. And that is usually local expertise. So to have people on the ground who you can trust is almost priceless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there one or two or three biggest pitfalls that Western companies or people behind these companies step into when they do business with India?
Yeah, I've already mentioned two. One is the company formation. If that is not done properly, it's really, really difficult to change that later on. You almost have to restart. That's almost a better way of doing it. Second is the choice of your partner, your business partners over there. In the Indian culture, we call it in the US the dog and pony show, right? So you go to a presentation and they explain to you, oh yeah, I know the prime minister, or I am related to this business person. I have contacts here, and so later on you find out it isn't so. And that has happened to a few companies who entered that market in India. And that's something that can be avoided with a rigorous background check and best practices in how to find your business partner, and also someone who has the same interests as you, the same aspirations, and where you can have a synergy rather than trying to pull the other person along with the other company. And you need to have the right checks and balances in place as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm thinking about from a cultural perspective. From a cultural perspective, you could argue that India and China are comparable. They're not the same. They're arch enemies. That's one thing, and they're not the same as Canadians are not the same as Americans, but they're comparable.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So to what extent? No, let's put it differently. what is easier, to do business with China or Chinese, or do business with India or Indians?
I would probably not respond to that from a cultural perspective, but more from a political context. I think it's safer to do business in India than in China, just from my perspective. If I had to say it, I think the Indian context is still a little simpler because of the language. You're still speaking a fairly similar language. There's some terms that will be confusing, but in general, they speak English. And so that already, it puts us on a more level playing field.
Sure.
Let me try and give you 3 examples of what is different between the Indian and the US, for example. Just in general, communication. In India, people are more contextual. There's indirect communication. So you need to be aware of social cues or body language much more than in the US. In the US, of course, there too, you can read entire books from a person's body language, right? But in India, that might be even more subtle. So for example, an Indian will hardly ever tell you no, but they will try to pick a different topic, or they will say, oh, let's get back to that later, or maybe we can try to solve that a different way, right? Rather than telling you no. And so it's important to practice active listening and just to try to learn some of the social cues that are rather indirect.
Yeah.
Then when it comes to time, the time in India has a very different connotation. It's not as exact as it would be in the Western context. When we say 1:00 p.m. or, our meeting started at 10, they do not think that 10 is really what you mean. It can be 10:15, it can be 10:30. And it's not always, or it's hardly ever meant to be rude. It's just that India is so dynamic that oftentimes they cannot stick to the time. Something happens. I don't know, during monsoon, you might get swept out. Or there's a power outage, or you can't get anywhere, right? So that's why you have to be very flexible when it comes to time. And I mean, I truly mean flexible. And that's very difficult for, especially me coming from Germany. It was 1:00. We were supposed to be here. You promised this to me. So we get into the whole realm of integrity. That's just, you have to be very flexible. And then finally, I just want to say that leadership and hierarchy is very different in India compared to the US. In the US, we're used to an egalitarian system. People are encouraged to speak up and maybe challenge the status quo. Well, in India, that's exactly the opposite. They need hierarchy. If their superior doesn't, what we would call, micromanage them, that person would think that they're not valued. They respect authority and seniority. If that is not there, they feel lost. They have no direction. I was once told, and I've seen this, I didn't know what was happening, and then somebody pointed out, like, if you take 3 Indians of sort of the same social status in the same room, you don't have to tell them what they're supposed to do. Just give them the task that needs to be accomplished, and to figure out and who does what. They will establish the hierarchy so that you don't have to do that, because they can't just all be at the same level. Indians are way too competitive to do that. So it's very important that you understand that the hierarchy is absolutely necessary, and an egalitarian system will not work at all in India, for most of the industries, I should say. But in general, it holds true.
Yeah. Frank, we have about a little less than 4 minutes, 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you to come up with your 3 tips that you can give us to become more culturally competent. I mean, you've done a number of 3 times already, so let's see if you can pick a few. Yeah.
Oh, Okay, I'm going to reiterate most of them. One is understand the local context. That means which state are you in? What countries are what languages are spoken? What religions are observed? What industry are you in? And what kind of local government is there? Local governments are supposed to compete against each other in India. This is why this is so important to understand. The two most important things that you can bring is patience and flexibility. That should bring about understanding of the first example that I just brought. And then finally, find local experts. Really the value of a local expert that you can trust and you can work with is very valuable. They can be your proxy, and they can help you to find the right people, make the right connections, figure out what's true, what's not, create a transparency that is so difficult to achieve, and just help you really to make progress in India in a shorter time frame than it would take you to do from a different country.
Yeah.
And so those are the three things that I would try to give your listeners on the way. And if they have any questions, they can, of course, always reach out to me.
Oh, that would have been my last question. So I got the 3 points. They'll be in the show notes. So if people do and would like to get in touch with you, how can they do that best?
I'm on LinkedIn, of course, and I'm sure we're going to share that link. Otherwise, we also have a website, which, yeah, it's wb-india.com. And other than that, I think if they cannot get in touch with me those ways, they can probably get in touch with you, and then you might be able to forward them to me. Yeah,
absolutely.
Fantastic.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, Frank, thanks so much for your time. And well, 10 o'clock is not that an early rise. But all right. Thanks anyways, and I'm pretty sure we'll bump into each other in the future.
Thank you very much, Chris. I really appreciate the time here with you at this show, and I hope your listeners got a lot of value out of it, and hope to speak again soon.
No doubt. Thank you.